when it comes to multiculturalism and multicultural experiments, I think that the main thing a lot of people have in mind, especially when they're talking about politics, is Islam in Europe. And I think that this is a really difficult question because on the one hand, we're talking about Islamic culture and European culture. But if we talk about European culture, it's a very abstract term. There are all sorts of cultures within Europe that can be considered European without necessarily implying that there is such a thing as European culture. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. So this is a really complex situation. So would you say that there is such a thing as a European culture? And if there is, could we use this as a sort of criterion to see whether Islamic culture can be compatible with it, in particular multicultural experiments within Europe?
My quick answer to that question is yes. But there is a word that you used, which I think is very important, namely the word continuity. So there is, as you say, there are obviously different European cultures, and you and I, for example, we could both personally attest to the fact that there is that continuity. You come from Greece and you live in England. I was born in Sweden. I live in the United States, also lived in other European countries. And yes, every time we have switched country, and I'm sure you know what I mean, there have been certain adjustments that have been necessary. But we have still been able to carry on what we do in a fairly normal way, if you will. And the adjustments that may have been required for us, well, maybe I shouldn't put words in your mouth actually, but I think maybe for a lot of people in our situation, the adjustments that we have to make are fairly superficial. And because there is a continuity there, even though, again, obviously a Sicilian is going to be very different from a Norwegian in lots of different ways. But they can still come together and live under a particular form of government, for example, without too much friction. That continuity breaks when it comes to Islam. Now, the reason why that break has not become more apparent earlier on, if you will, to a lot of people, is, to touch on something that I mentioned before, is because the Christian European culture has been so watered down. And because it has been so watered down, and because a lot of people don't have the religious mindset, if you will, anymore, that break hasn't become so obvious. If European peoples had been more religious, always going to church on Sundays and believing fervently in God and so on, that break would have been much more apparent, which is why earlier generations really of Europeans, of Westerners, understood this much better than we do today. By earlier generations, I mean basically through the 19th century or so, if you will, but especially pre-Enlightenment, but even after the Enlightenment and up until maybe early 20th century or so, first half, they understood this much better. They understood that break much better than we do, the lack of continuity there, because there we're not speaking of questions of degree, we're really speaking of questions of kind when it comes to Christianity and Islam, and that's because we do not and that's because Christianity and Islam are so fundamentally different, not just in terms of theological aspects, but also in terms of worldly, governmental, political aspects. If anything, the worldly aspects, the worldly differences might be even stronger than the theological differences, although, of course, there are also many theological differences. And that is something that Europeans need to begin to understand. We haven't, the problem also is that Europeans, I include Americans here to some extent as well, but we're not as exposed to Islam here in the United States, of course, as many peoples are in Northern and Western Europe. But the issue is that even though most Europeans today have left religion behind and therefore do not understand what a religion genuinely is, they are still inheritors of a Christian tradition, in the sense that they tend to, and this is especially true of the Protestant peoples more so than of the Catholic peoples, they have a Protestant and especially a Lutheran understanding of what religion is. That is to say, they believe that religion is about direct personal communication between the believer and God. And if that's all religion is, and that's not all religion is, but if that is the main facet of religion, this quite Lutheran conception, then there should be no problem in I communicating directly to my God in one way, and this Muslim over here communicating to his God in a different way. We can do it side by side. That's not a problem. And so in that sense, European peoples are still very clearly Protestant. Again, talking now mostly about Scandinavians and Germans and the English, who are also Protestant, different type of Protestant, but still. And that conception, that religious worldview, even for those people who are no longer religious, remains. And so there is a lack of understanding of the fact that the Islamic worldview includes the political. Catholics sometimes have a slightly better understanding of this. I mean, slightly better sometimes, because the political dimension, because of the pontiff and so on, is slightly stronger in Catholicism. But by and large, that understanding has been lost as well. And so there is really no longer a question of continuity. It is a very clear break between those two worldviews.
Right. So these are mostly religious distinctions that you mentioned. But I think that whenever we're talking about Lutheranism, there is always the question of the implication of the separation between church and state.
Right.
And that implies that a lot of Europeans, particularly those of a Protestant background or those who have been influenced by a Protestant culture, even if they claim themselves to be atheists, they adopt a more, they think that the separation between church and state is a civilizational given, and they use this as a means to understand other people. Do you think that this is a particular mistake that a lot of Europeans are susceptible to, or a lot of Westerners are susceptible to when they're in contact with foreign cultures?
Absolutely. And this is a type of maybe arrogance is too strong a word, because they're not aware that they're doing it, but ignorance certainly of other ways, of non-Western ways of the world. They think that other peoples see the nexus of politics and religion in the same way as we do. And the problem is that we really need a whole different set of terms for some of these things. The fact that we speak of religion on the one hand, and we speak of politics on the other hand, that in itself is already a problem, because that leads us to believe that in other cultures, or at least in some other cultures, these two are very distinct entities. Now, of course, in Islam, you can still distinguish, as in any spiritual or religious system, you can still distinguish between worldly concerns or political concerns on the one hand and theological concerns on the other. Of course, I'm not saying that they're identical, but the fact is that in the Islamic conception as a whole, and Islam we think of as a religion, that distinction that we have, religion is one thing, politics is another, does not exist in the same way at all. And this is why when, for example, a Christian missionary tries to make a non-Christian become a Christian, he is primarily trying to convince them of a theological worldview. Whereas when a Muslim tries to make another person become a Muslim, again, obviously there will be individual exceptions, but by and large, in a very un-Christian way, he is not just pushing a theological system, but also a political system, or what we would call, again, that distinction already presupposes a Western mindset, but what we would call a political construct or a political system. And that's and we don't really have the language to express that. And because our word religion, because of our history, especially after the 30 Years' War, but even more so after the Enlightenment, our language is not adequate to express these things, because we have this very watered down view of religion. And the first step, I think, in beginning to understand what is happening in Western and Northern Europe right now is to understand how inadequate the terms are that we use. There are other terms as well that are highly problematic that we could discuss, but that's certainly some of them, yeah.
Right. So I understand your views about the general clash between Islam and the West, but I think it would be really good for our audience if you gave us particular examples of where is the clash visible in specific cases. So when it comes to clash of values, because what are the values that Westerners have that supporters of Islam or Muslims don't accept, or values that are so are not held in common, and that creates a problem with coexisting.
Yeah, so that's how many hours do we have here? Yeah. So basically, the first thing I would probably say is that we have, you mentioned the separation of church and state. We this is admittedly, to be fair, to Islam here, this is not based primarily in scripture in the Quran, but as a historical matter, in Islam, the Prophet and the political leader was the same person, and then that continued later on as well, where the head of state was also the head of the church, head of the mosque, head of the religious system. Again, that wasn't always the case, but as a historical matter, that has tended to be the case in the Islamic world. So that's the first thing I think that we need to understand, which means that the head of state, Europeans have to understand that their heads of state are by their very nature unacceptable to a mainstream Islamic worldview. And it's important to say mainstream here because it's not some tiny minority fringe. This is really, we're talking about mainstream here. And that then expresses itself, of course, in many other ways. Along with that, we have, of course, maybe most obviously, the inferior position of women in Islamic society. Now, again, as apologists of Islam will always point out, the Quran, and this is true, does contain a number of provisions for the correct and just treatment of women, for example, in divorce proceedings and so on. That's all there, and was quite liberal, probably for its time and place. But of course, times change and places change. And now that it is certainly the case that our worldview today of equality of the sexes is intolerable. And of course, this is an area where where conservatives might say that well, maybe the Muslims have a point here, but and one sometimes sees on certain fringes, if you will, of the right, a respect for Islam for this reason. And for certain similar reasons. But it's important to understand that even if we say from a more nowadays conservative point of view that there are differences between men and women, it shouldn't be conservative really, it should be common sense. But even if we say that, the subjugation of women is still something that most people today wouldn't accept, even on the more conservative side. And I mean, I could go on. The fact that non-Muslims, everybody should become a Muslim. Ultimately, and the fact that Christians and Jews exist in society could be accepted and has sometimes been accepted, historically speaking, because they are people of the book, but they should nonetheless be subjugated to the Islamic population. Doesn't mean that they should necessarily be forcibly converted. Many Muslims, including respected scholars in Islamic jurisprudence, would say that you should not forcibly convert anyone to Islam, but they are still subjugated, non-Muslims, and they live as a second-class population. All of these things have to be understood by Europeans. It has to be understood that if the current trend continues, then these are all things that will come to pass. And we already see this. I mean, if we had had this conversation 10 years ago, we would be speaking in the future tense. But I think today we can speak increasingly in the present tense because we see this in a number of European countries, how already accommodations have been made for the Islamic worldview, and that's going to become more and more extreme. And a lot of the ruling classes don't notice this because they, of course, live in wealthier non-Islamic enclaves of their cities. It's, as always, the lower classes that have to suffer the consequences of the policies of the upper classes. And we see that a lot now in poorer neighborhoods where Islamic immigrants move in.
If you would like to see the full version of this premium video, please head over to lotuseaters.com and subscribe to gain full access to all of our premium content.